Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Swan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in the field of South African tax. And seeing that this episode would be published on the 19th of December, I'm quite sure that a lot of you are already transitioning into holiday mode. So I'm going to make sure that this episode is just long enough to not break that transition. So other than the casual clothes on the video, seeing that we are in holiday season, my holiday joke, and then if you look here behind me on the video, there's a few elves on the shelf. Other than that, we're sticking to serious tax matters as always. Right, so today we're talking about Kuwait, and it's not a geography or history lesson. Rather, we're talking about the recently ratified protocol that amends the South Africa-Kuwait tax treaty. Now, I guess the first question that would come up with many of you, why is the treaty between South Africa and Kuwait then so important or newsworthy that I'm doing an episode on it? Now, when South Africa introduced dividends tax in 2012, part of that process was to also amend certain treaties that at the time provided for a zero withholding tax on dividends. So that list included the UK, Australia, I think there were about 10 or so of them, and Kuwait was one of those treaties. But the difference between the Kuwait one and the rest is that the Kuwait protocol has not yet come into force until now. Now, that in itself, I guess, is probably still not that newsworthy or that noteworthy, but if you then look at it combined with the Dutch and the Swedish treaties. Now, these treaties have what they call a most favorable nation clause. For companies where there's a Dutch or a Swedish company that is the beneficial owner of dividend income that comes from a South African company where this beneficial owner holds at least 10% of the capital of the South African company. So the Dutch and the Swedish treaties, if you look at the protocols, state that dividends tax would be withheld at 5%, but then they go on to say that if South Africa concluded double tax agreements with more favorable rates or basis with another country, then that rate will apply. And that's where Kuwait fits in. The Kuwait treaty up to this point said that, or stated that it was a 0% withholding tax on these types of dividends. Now, the application of the most favorable nation clause has been subject to various disputes. One that went to the tax court in South Africa, SARS didn't appeal the outcome. And in the Netherlands, the Supreme Court both ruled in favor of the taxpayer. Now, whether what makes the Dutch one a bit different from the Swedish most favorable nation clause is the fact that the Dutch clause refers to where this more favorable rate comes from a DTA that was concluded after the Dutch protocol was concluded. Now, if you look at when the Kuwait treaty was concluded, that was around 2007. The Dutch protocol was 2008. So if you just look at the dates, then it would seem as if the most favorable nation clause wouldn't apply. But what the taxpayers then argued was to say, but South Africa, after concluding the Dutch protocol, concluded the Swedish protocol. And the Swedish protocol doesn't have this timeline on it. So because South Africa concluded the Swedish protocol, that also has a most favorable nation clause that refers or that depends on the Kuwait treaty. There was a DTA concluded after the Dutch one, and therefore the most favorable nation clause also applied in the context of the Dutch DTA, and the courts agreed with the taxpayers. So therefore, up to this point, if there were dividends declared by these South African companies to Dutch or Swedish beneficial owners who held more than 10% of the capital of the South African company, a zero dividends withholding tax applied. Now, from 2 October 2024, that's no longer the case. The the Kuwait Treaty has now been amended by the protocol. So it's definitely no longer a 0% on dividends going to Kuwait, to the Netherlands, and to Sweden. Obviously, the Kuwait Treaty protocol also amends various other aspects of the Kuwait Treaty. As I've mentioned, the entry into force date is stated as the 2nd of October, but many commentators have already identified that there is possibly an aspect of implied retrospectivity in the Kuwait Treaty. So it refers to having effect from the date when South Africa introduced a tax on dividends at the shareholder level. And this wording you find in paragraph 2 of Article 7 of the protocol. So I think the question about retrospectivity probably still exists, and there's at least some uncertainty or controversy likely to come from the fact that paragraph 2 of Article 7 has this retrospective type of wording in it. The idea is definitely not to delve into this complex topic for our podcast today. I think it's something that I would expect it to be further developments around it. So, in closing for today, the first thing to remember is that the Kuwait Treaty, the protocol, has now come into force, and it affects dividends to Kuwait, the Netherlands, and to Swedish companies holding at least 10% of the capital of South African companies. The second point to be aware of is this effective date of 2 October, but then paragraph 2 of Article 7, I think, is likely to cause some uncertainty and some arguments as to retrospectivity. But that is something that remains to be seen how that will play out. And I think there's a lot of interpretation involved in what to do with that clause. That's it for today. If you like the podcast, please like it on Google Podcasts, subscribe on your other favorite platforms where you listen to podcasts to be notified whenever a new episode comes out. And please also tell your friends and colleagues about the podcast. That's the only way we can grow the listener base. If you've got any ideas for future episodes, feedback, please send me an email. I've already received quite a few emails from listeners, so it's really nice to see that people are listening and interacting. My email address is in the show notes. And then, as always, the content of the podcast is for information purposes only. It's not intended to be tax advice or even a replacement for fact-specific tax advice. Until next time, enjoy the holidays. Goodbye.